As was mentioned, I'm going to talk about teaching by the case method, and I'm actually not used to a room like this, so I may wander a bit. I'm a wanderer. This is the way I generally teach, and I thought it would be easiest for me to tell you about how I teach and why I teach that way, and maybe some tricks of the trade for those of you who are interested. There is a handout here, and I guess I apologize for the length, but I thought I would go overboard and kind of give you some materials that might be helpful to you when you go back and actually plan your own class. When I teach every day, the first thing I start out with are the learning objectives for that day's session. And for today, the learning objectives for today are going to be, I want you to become familiar with what it means, at least to me, to teach by the case method. Understand what I view as some of the pedagogical advantages of that method, and therefore why I choose to use it. And then also I'm going to spend most of my time on some of the tricks of the trade that have been helpful to me over the years in actually making this an effective teaching method, maybe help you when you try to do this on your own. Has anybody here taught by the case method? Tim, 1, 2, that's all, huh? Okay. What are some of the rest of you? One of the things I will mention when you teach by the case method, it's very helpful to know your audience. I know my students pretty well, and I don't know you folks at all, except one of our GSB PhD students is here and a GSB faculty member. But just a couple of people. What areas of the school or university are you from? Where are you from? Economics. Earth Sciences. History. Physics. Okay, all over the place. All right, well, that helps a little bit. I'm going to go through this presentation, but please interrupt me with questions. I'd be delighted to answer questions, and hopefully when we get through it all, there'll be time for questions at the end, but I'd be delighted to answer questions as you go. All right, in my view, what is teaching by the case method? Well, the first thing on the list, I think, is that it uses a real-world situation as a basis for learning. And there are cases. You've probably seen Harvard Business School cases. We write them at the Stanford Business School as well, so they're actually self-contained. They're usually, I have one here, it's 4 or 5 pages long, and then some exhibits. But also, I also use excerpts from materials and other things that are referred to kind of as case materials, even if I don't have a formal written up case. I just came from a class today where I taught the financial reporting implications of Disney Company's acquisition of ABC Capital Cities. And I didn't have a case, but there was an article in Barron's that had ripped apart the accounting, and that was sort of the formation of the case. And then I had other articles and readings that I put together as a packet for the students so that they could understand the situation that surrounded this acquisition, and we could talk about the details of it, even though I didn't have a formal case. So you can use this method even if there's not an existing case, or you don't want to take the time to actually write one, although it doesn't take that long to write a case. The other thing about it is that it's an interactive discussion format. I'm hoping I'll get some interaction here today, because I don't like to stand up and hear myself talk all the time. And I'll tell you why why I think that's a good thing. But and the third thing it's important, is it really requires the students to be prepared and engaged in the class discussion. You as faculty members or would-be faculty members are going to be prepared when you teach, but you have to have the students become prepared, and then you can have a meaningful discussion. So sort of these 3 elements to me is what makes case teaching. When you have all of these 3 things, I think some great educational things can happen in the classroom. So why do I use the case method? The primary reason is that I'm a believer in active learning. What I mean by this is that if I just stand up here and talk like I've been doing already, you'll retain some of this, you'll remember some of it, and you'll walk out and won't remember all of it. If you actively participate, at least is my belief, if you actively participate in your learning, you're going to own it. You'll remember more of it. If you raise your hand and ask a question or make an observation, and somebody else on the other side of the room says, "Yes, but had you thought about this?" you're always going to remember that. And kind of the neatest times in class is when a student will raise their hand and say, "Well, I think the company should do this." And I'll say, "Well, why?" And they'll say, "Well, because..." "Oh, no, never mind, that wouldn't work." And they've discovered that, is to sort of discovery learning. They've discovered that for themselves, and they will always remember that. But if I had just stood up there and said, no, the company can't do this for the following reason, they would have written it down and walked out and never would have remembered it, never would have owned it. So that's actually the primary reason. I really believe students learn more from this method of teaching. A second advantage that I see is that you get real-time feedback on student comprehension and in the classroom. So, you look out at a sea of faces. You can't read people's minds as an instructor. You have no idea whether they're thinking, this is so obvious and boring, why is she wasting my time? Or, I'm completely lost, I have no idea what she's talking about, wish she would go into more detail or explain things. And so if you have this interaction going with the students, you get feedback from them. They're asking questions, you're asking them questions, and you can constantly gauge where they are they with you or not, and then you have the flexibility in the classroom to divert what you're doing and kind of clear up expectations. Or if everybody's with you and it's just, we've done it, we don't have to talk about it, move on to something else. And so I think you are more efficient in the classroom, more effective, and I think the students enjoy it more. Another important objective, and this is certainly true in the business school, and I think it's probably true in just about every field in the university, is that this is a way to teach critical thinking and how to exercise judgment. It's not just teaching technical material. I could teach technical material, I could tell them the debits and credits, how to do this, but first of all, that's not what accounting is about, the way I view accounting. That's what bookkeepers do, that's not what accountants do. And by focusing in the classroom on discussion and having the students test out their ideas and ask them questions that make them think and come up with their own views, they're beginning to understand how to think critically and analyze issues. There are always pros and cons to just about every issue, but it's really difficult to know without a lot of experience, in our case in the business world, how to weigh those pros and cons. Whereas in the classroom you can simulate that to a certain extent because, well, the answer could be A or it could be B. Well, why would it be A? There's 5 things. And you begin to understand which of those 5 things is important and which isn't important, or in this particular case, and why one of those might be important in another situation. So it really, I believe, helps us teach critical thinking and judgment, and I think that's a very important part of what we should be doing. It also helps to bridge the gap between the classroom and the real world, and again, this is something I think is not unique to the business school. You think about textbooks. Everything in textbooks is canned, and it's kind of little examples, and everything works neatly. They tell you in the question exactly what you need to know to solve the question, solve the problem. Not much more, not much less. So the students know what they have to do. You go out in the real world and it's chaos, right? No idea what information is important, how to gather information, how to sift through it, figure out what's important, what's not important, how to make sense out of that chaos. The case method is kind of in between. It's not the real world. It's 5 or 6 pages and a bunch of exhibits. So the case writer has narrowed it down quite a lot, but on the other hand, there's a lot more there than is typically there in a textbook or in a made-up problem. And so it's kind of halfway in between. It sort of begins to teach the students how to figure out what's important to their analysis, what isn't important, things that they should be thinking about. Some of the other advantages that I see are this notion of primary and secondary learning. And what I mean by this is I'm an accounting professor. I teach primarily financial reporting issues, and so in that sense, that's the primary learning. I mean, today's topic in my class was thinking about how to recognize acquisition reserves in the context of a business combination. I'm teaching a mergers and acquisitions course. That's the primary learning. And but one of the nice things about a case is that, we did Disney's acquisition of ABC. And so they learned a bit about the entertainment industry, what's important, how managers think about mergers, what was important in this situation, what wasn't important. The last class we talked about Uniphase's acquisition of JDS Fitel, which is a high-tech company. And they learned more about active and passive fiber optics components and what was important and how the cable system works and all these things that would not be a part of their normal learning. So it's makes it interesting because you have context And in accounting, you can't do accounting in a vacuum, as I would imagine a lot of other fields represented in this room. And so not only do you set context, but it allows them to learn about something other than your topic area. It learns the context in which that fits, and secondary learning takes place. So that's kind of an added benefit. Another thing is that complexities of real-world problems are part of the analysis. And what I mean by this is, I'm not good enough to make up situations that have the subtleties and the interesting nuances that happen in the real world. And yet, when they're in a case, I mean, it's just there. You don't have to think about everything. The company is, in our case, we use case companies. The company is operating in a complex environment, and that becomes obvious through the case. And you get questions from students sometimes like, can they really do this? And it's like, well, I guess so, because they did. They're not quite, I didn't make it up, so it's not, my credibility is not on the line. This is actual fact. And sometimes you say, okay, here's the subject that we want to talk about, and this thing could have an effect. Well, if you tell them that, you just tell them, they say, okay, that could have an effect. But if you're using a case, you can see how big the effect is, how much you know about the effect, how that effect is playing out. And sometimes when I walk in the class, the downside of this, all of this, is I walk in the classroom having prepared the case, right? Many of these cases I wrote. I teach electives, so I teach a lot of my own material. But there's some things in these cases that I've never seen before, or things that I haven't thought about before, and the students will raise questions. Well, what about this, or what about that? And it's like, well, where did you, how did you get to there from what was in the case? And it's always there. So when you've got 60 people, or what the size of our classrooms, reading cases and asking questions, there's just a lot of rich detail there that can help enrich the discussion and help enrich their learning of your subject matter. Unstructured problems. Again, this gets to the complexity and making sense out of chaos, which is one of the things that we try to help our students learn how to do. It's a real-world situation is unstructured. The case is just a description, and then there'll be some guidance and some assignment questions, which I'll talk about in a minute, but gives them an opportunity to do this, learn what's important and what isn't. And as a result of that, they learn to deal with ambiguity and incomplete information. A lot of our students come, and particularly in accounting class, they think, when they've never had one before, sort of at this level, they think of it as bookkeeping, and it's like, well, what's the answer? Is the answer 2 or 6, or there must be a right answer? And it's like, well, no. Accounting is an art, it's not a science. If it was that cut and dried, none of us would be interested in it. There would be no research to be done. Just would not be an interesting field of study. And they begin to understand that and start getting comfortable with the fact that they have to make judgments. They won't always have all the information they need. I mean, you give them a case and there's selected information. Good case writer gives them basically what they need and some extra stuff. And it won't be everything they need. And actually many times in class I'll ask them, what else would you like to know before you make this decision, or before you can figure out how to think about this problem? And many times in the real world, if you're, depending on who you are, these things are not knowable. In my class, for example, talk about financial reporting, and there's kind of 3 constituents that I deal with in the cases. One is corporate management, who are issuing annual reports to shareholders, trying to communicate to the outside world what's been going on inside the company, the performance of the company, and these sorts of things. You've got analysts on the outside of the company reading these reports and having other publicly available information, trying to figure out what's going on inside the company. And then you have the accounting standard setters, who are coming up with the rules of the game, as it were. And as an analyst, you're never going to know everything that you would like to know inside the company. So how do you kind of treat this as a puzzle and figure out what you can learn, what you can't learn, how important is what you can't know? And so a lot of this they can learn better, I think, with using the case method. And so many times I'll know what the educational objective of the course of the case is. Say, okay, these are the kinds of things that I want the students to grapple with. So I'm not just going to tell them outright, but I'll make sure that the case has, there's seeds planted in the case so that it will raise this issue in their minds. So as they're thinking about it, that, you know, the seeds have been planted, but the answer is not there, or how to think about it. The other thing that's really, it's a little hard for me because I don't teach all your fields, and I never have, so I can't relate it directly to what you're doing. But one of the dangers that you have with using cases in a business context is the company did something at the end, right? Usually, it's fun to have the case set as a decision context, because then you ask the students at the end, okay, now that we spent an hour and 40 minutes, you know, sorting through all this and analyzing, and we've heard the pros and cons, and we've heard everybody's points of view, and, you know, I've led the discussion and tried to bring out what I think needs to be brought out. And then the last few minutes, like, okay, well, what are you going to do? You know, if you were management, what would you do? And try to help them come to closure and say, okay, gee, I have to make a decision. I can't just say there are pros and cons. I have to weigh them in my own mind and come up with something. And oftentimes, in many of the cases, of course, are known to be real cases. Some fictitious cases are really based on real cases. You just disguise the names. But you can tell the students what the company ended up doing. And if you tell them that ahead of time, they believe that's the right answer. But it's not necessarily the right answer. It just happens to be what that management did. Or even I ask them, you know, how do you think investors are going to respond when they find out about all this stuff? And, you know, we did an acquisition, Uniphase's acquisition of JDS Vitel, and usually on an acquisition, the acquired company stock goes down. The acquiring company, stock price goes down on the date of announcement. This company went up. So at the end of the class, it was like, well, what do you think is going to happen? You've analyzed this deal. You know what's going on. Is this a good deal or a bad deal? And what do you think the stock market reaction is going to be? I mean, if they knew ahead of time what it was, there'd be nothing. It would be nothing interesting to think about. So you definitely, that's part of your role as an instructor and a case writer, is to try to set the stage so the students will learn what it is you want to learn. Other questions? Please. Okay, so how do we do this? And I have kind of 4 different areas that I'm going to talk about. And you'll see some of them are process and some of them are content. And actually, when you teach by the case method, process is important because you're trying to manage the learning process in the classroom. It's not a matter of preparing it all in advance. I never quite know what's going to happen when I go into class. I have a plan, and I think I know what's going to happen. I know how I think it's going to go, but it doesn't always happen. Happened to me this morning, but we'll talk about that. I guess first and foremost, you have to care about students' learnings. That's, you know, maybe that should, you know, doesn't need to be said, but I guess I'm going to say it. And because sometimes students feel as if some professors don't care about their learning. And if you really care, then you're going to be more focused on asking them the right questions, challenging them the right way in the classroom, thinking about all these issues when you're writing the case. And they will sense that. And if you care, then they start caring. And then they learn a lot more. Get to know the students. This helps immensely. As I said, I feel like I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here because I don't know all you folks. But there are many advantages to knowing the students. First of all, if you understand their backgrounds and what their weaknesses are, or their, you know, kind of holes in their backgrounds, you can be sensitive to trying to fill some of those in. When I have, and I'll show you in a second how I get some of this information, but particularly at the business school, I have students who take my class who are taking it because they think it's like really important stuff and they need to know this stuff. They don't get it. They've never seen it before. They don't know anything about it, but they just know they need to learn it. Other people that take my class have done this in the real world before. They've done mergers and acquisitions. They work for investment bankers, but they didn't quite understand all of it. So they have a lot of experience to bring to bear, and they know a lot. Well, if you don't manage the discussion appropriately in the classroom, the people who are kind of new are going to feel completely overwhelmed by the people who seem to know everything. They don't know everything, which is why they're taking the course, but they talk like they do, and they intimidate some of the other students. And the other thing is, when you're managing the class discussion, so you can try to figure out who to call on at different points of time in the class. Who's going to be able to contribute what? Who's likely to be confused? Who's likely to be able to, if the discussion is wandering and you kind of want to move on and have somebody bring it to a close without you doing it. Who are the strong people in the room who could probably kind of summarize the point and move on. So it helps you manage the classroom. It helps you ensure that they learn, each individual student learns as much as they can learn, because you can bring them along as individuals if you know them. The other thing is, particularly if you use real companies, we have fantastic students here at Stanford. And they have all kinds of experiences, and they know people, and they know things, and they've done things. And to the extent you can use that in the classroom, it enhances everybody's learning. I know a fair bit about accounting, but there's a lot of stuff I don't know anything about. And whether it's technical details about, electronic components, or I have a couple of law students in my class, and every once in a while something will come up in a case, and one of my students will say, well, what about this? Or won't they get into legal trouble? I look around and say, where are my lawyers? You guys answer the questions. And it's great because that way everybody in the room is contributing to the learning of everybody else in the room. They're not depending solely on me to come up with everything. And I learn a lot. I walk out sometimes. There was a student in my class this morning who had worked at Disney while Disney did the acquisition of Cap City. So we had a discussion about why did they do it, what were the strategic reasons for the acquisition, and students gave us all the strategic reasons for the acquisition, all the stuff that was in the popular press, and then this guy said, well, actually, Eisner's ego had a lot to do with this. And it was kind of interesting to bring a different perspective to the conversation. And so I knew that he worked at Disney, so I was kind of saving him. You don't let him talk immediately, because you let the other students kind of struggle with some of these ideas, and then give them the floor and let them talk. And often we have students who have direct experience in the case companies or in something closely related, or whatever. And every once in a while, you get great class guests come to class. I have a student whose his father was vice president of one of the companies that we did. Would you like my father to come to class? He actually did this deal. It's like, absolutely. So there are many reasons that it's good to get to know the students, and so you can treat them as individuals. The other thing is to set expectations for students and you, and meet them. And I have some things here. I'll show you how I do some of this stuff. But if you set the expectations and you set them high, most of the time the students are going to respond. And you set high expectations for yourself as well, and then they can see that you're putting in a lot of effort. They will put in a lot of effort as well, and it'll be a much higher quality in the classroom. Again, this bullet relates to things I was just talking about a second ago. Encourage students to share their experiences and knowledge. What we're talking about is a discussion. Right? We're not having here a discussion because I didn't ask you to prepare anything for today. Can't even cold call on you, but encourage their students to do this, and it enriches the discussion, not just from facts that they know, but different perspectives, people who come from different backgrounds, technical backgrounds or less technical backgrounds. They view the world different ways, and it's really, again, enriches the discussion to consider all the perspectives from the students that are there, and help put the case in context. And then the other thing, actually, I've listed this under student learning. You need to be engaged, so that is important. In your handout, I put some things just to kind of give you a sense for some of the things that I do. I'll put them up here. Well, let's see. What's the best way to do this here? Let me just flip through them with you. Again, there's just at the business school we get. I actually have slides. This will be okay. We'll do it quickly. We get cards like this for every student. So before I walk in the classroom, I have the student's picture. I know where they're from, and I know a little bit about their background. Very little. I like to know more than this. But before I walk in the class the first day, I've read through it, and I know about 50 or 60% that I've memorized. And I don't do them all, but this is a big advantage. These squares are where I grade class participation, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. The other thing I do is I ask I ask for this on the first day. Just sort of say, you know, how comfortable are you with accounting? To get this sense of who's in the classroom. And some of the tricks are, invariably I get almost everybody to say medium, and then a few highs and a few lows. And sometimes the lows will write me notes saying, please help me. They don't sign their name necessarily, so I can walk into class the next day. I said, you know, we got a bunch of people right in the middle, but there's some people high, some people low. You low people, don't worry about it. Just ask questions, you know. And so you kind of put them at ease a little bit. It also helps because if you go back and tell them, then the people who put high know that, you know, they're on the high end. They really, you know, based on self-reporting, it's not like 90% of the students think they have a really high accounting background. Most of them are going to be medium. So it helps me get a sense of who's in the classroom generally, and I always report back to anything I ask the students for. I always report back to them the next time. I'll just give them the numbers. Then it takes 2 seconds. In terms of background, as I said on those cards, I don't get a lot. So this is a handout that I used for my the first day of this current class. I talk about the topics that are going to be covered. So if anybody has experience in these topics, and then the case companies that we're using. So if anybody has experience in those, and they fill them out. Even, you know, a lot of them say none. I don't have any. It's like, that's fine. But then I file them away, and then before class, I kind of scan down them to see if anybody, you know, just like this guy that had worked at Disney today. So I know he's there and know he can contribute to the discussion. In the, there's another form that this one is a little bit less. This is just sort of tell me anything that is, you know, if you think you have anything relevant to the course that I should know about. But again, I explain to them up here that it's because I want to know about their experience, both to get to know them and also to manage the discussion. So it's a more general type of form. In terms of setting expectations, these are overheads that I use on the first day of class. You can read through them if you want, but this is how I set expectations. It's all clearly laid out in the syllabus, and then talk about how I'm going to teach. There's a group project, but why I teach that way, some of the things I've just told you, but these are handouts that I give to the students, and we talk through them. Here's the shared responsibility, you and me. And I got to go through these, and I tell them, you know, you expect me to be prepared for class every day. Well, I expect you to be prepared for class every day. We're in this together. We're here to learn together. It's not me teaching you. You have to learn. And so we talk about these things. And this is the expectations that I try to set on the first day. And then the syllabus is all more written out in the syllabus as to what the course is about, how the we'll come back to this later. This particular course, I grade 50% on class participation. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But what does class participation mean to me? I lay out for them so they know what I expect of them. And so you can have a look at this to whatever extent. But that's what I mean by, you know, how I get to know the students. I also talk to them, obviously, after class starts, but at least try to get a sense for who they are, what they know, and how it relates to what we're up to. Okay, next thing is structure the discussion. You know, it's nothing worse than coming into class and say, let's talk about Disney's acquisition of ABC, you know, for an hour and 45 minutes, and nobody has any clue, you know, where you're going or why. And you can imagine that in a case discussion, you know, if you're not careful, it can degenerate to that. So what I try to do structure for myself is identify the learning objectives for the day, for the course, which is for the class session, and then for the case itself. Our classes are an hour and 45 minutes, and so I usually talk about the case for about an hour 10, hour 15, and then at the beginning of class I do some kind of interactive lecture stuff on some of the technical material before we get into it. So the objectives for the class aren't always exactly the same as the objectives for the case. I actually use the learning objectives for the case as a wrap-up at the end. Say, this is what I had hoped you were going to learn from this case. And because we do it by the case method, I never quite know. As I said, you never know. You walk in the classroom, you have an idea, particularly if you've done the case before, but you don't know if you get to everything. You try to, but if things get really interesting, you can kind of move off your plan a bit. Set a range of assignment questions. This is important. It's just try to say, okay, here's a case, and now here are the 3, 4, 5 questions, no more than that I want you to think about as you're preparing the case. And in accounting, there's always a question or two on crunching some numbers. right? I mean, that's what it's about. But always sort of starts out generally. It says, okay, what is this company about? What's their strategy? What are they trying to do? Why are we doing this? Then run through some numbers, whatever the numbers happen to be, counting different ways. How do you think about it? Then what's your judgment on which of these is better, which better reflects the underlying economics, whatever it happens to be, and then kind of usually a question on, well, what would you do? Or what do you think management should do? Or to kind of come to closure. And I go through those questions in class, but not necessarily sort of in order. It's not like, okay, we take question 1, 2, 3. There are more questions that help them think about how to prepare for the class, not necessarily if they have these answers, they shouldn't come to class. If they've thought about these questions, then they can have this kind of discussion that I want to have. And I'll show you those in a second. And then the other thing I do is I structure the discussion with overheads that I hand out before class. These are the overheads for today's class. They're actually thinner than normal because there was some pretty tough number crunching that took a bunch of time. But this is what I hand them. Oh, for our MBA students, all has to have 3 holes. They don't like it if you don't have 3 holes. The first thing is the learning objectives, and I put some of these in your case. And then these are my overheads. Okay, and sometimes I'll have some, if there's some, today there weren't any specific numbers that I put in here, but every overhead has a question at the top. Acquisition reserves, what are they, why do they arise? We spent 25 minutes on this slide this morning, which was a lot more than I had intended, but we had a very interesting discussion. And then at the top, so the top is every page, are all questions, and I have some sense of how long I want to spend, so it's how much space I leave. And when I'm done, let's take a second here. This is from my class today. The overheads are filled out based on what the students say, and so when they get done. So the question is, how do I not give it away? Well, I don't give them any answers. I only give them the questions. And when they're done, their notes are organized. So they sense that we didn't wander from topic to topic, that we talked about this, we talked about that, and the questions build to the end the way I want to build things. I don't always know what they're going to say. That's why it's not all filled out, because it is a discussion, and I'll write down points that they'll talk about and figure out whether, to the extent they have merit. If there are numbers that are crunching that I don't want them to waste time, I'll put like with an acquisition, I may put down the 2 companies' sets of numbers and say, okay, now what would the company look like if we use purchase accounting? And those are blanks, and then we'll fill them in together in class, and they'll help me figure out what numbers. But I kind of do some of that stuff, so they don't know the answer, but this facilitates their note taking and shows them that there's organization, but it's only questions. Is Disney managing earnings or properly accounting for the acquisition? The very last slide. What should management do in response to the criticism? To again try to bring it together, but always questions that they can answer. And I choose the questions carefully. So again, in your handouts, course objective for the first day, course learning objectives that I give them on the first day. This was today's assignment. They're reading, and then the 4 assignment questions. Turns out in this case the first question was really the technical stuff. Abe Brilloff had written an article in Barron's that had a lot of numbers in it, and it was not quite right, and caused their stock price to drop. And it provided an interesting setting in which to talk about these reserves. It's always nice to have an interesting setting because they get the students engaged. When it's a fun topic or something hit the news or whatever, then they're more inclined to really get into it and enjoy the conversation. At the same time, they're learning about the stuff that you want them to. So those are the assignment questions. Then today, the ones I showed you just a second ago, these are the learning objectives for today. Today's class, and then at the end, I put up the learning objectives for the Disney case. And this serves as a wrap-up. I mean, I don't tell them, here are the facts I wanted you to learn, because they're going to take away what they want. But these are the things that I hope by the end of the discussion they have come to understand better than when they walked in. And this is the summary of the case. It's kind of the takeaways, if you will, that I want them to have. Okay. Managing the discussion. That's obviously, that's the substantive part of this. But to be successful, you have to do it. And ask open-ended, provocative questions. And again, the selection of the questions is key to kind of lead the discussion, build on the discussion where you want the discussion to go, and to get across the educational objectives that you have. Follow up on incomplete responses. Sometimes a student will say something half. It's like, come back to them and make sure that you dig down deep enough. Or have other students, somebody will say something and say, sometimes I'll just get this puzzled look on my face. Say, does everybody agree with that? And then somebody say, well, I'm not sure that was quite right because of, blah. And so you get the other students engaged. It's not me responding to each student. It's the students talking to each other with me kind of orchestrating the whole thing. Focus on accomplishing the learning objectives. It's nice to write down the learning objectives for the students, but it's nice to write down for you. So you remember what is it you're trying to accomplish, particularly because you get into these interesting discussions. And sometimes the student will want to take the discussion off in some other direction. And once you have the learning objectives down, you can say, what, that's very interesting, but not now, not today. Let's come back to what we're talking about. So you don't just let things travel wherever they want to go. Everybody knows what it is you're talking about and why, and that gives you the right to call things out of bounds. Tie in points that made previously, just like you can imagine, like any discussion. Fred, that relates to what Fred said 15 minutes ago, because he said this, and it's very similar, but blah, 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 to help them understand the tie-ins. Or, this is what Cosby said 3 classes ago. Do you remember we had a discussion about blah, and Cosby raised this issue? It's the same thing, only so to help them see connections across during the class time and between classes. Input from range of students, we talked about that a bit, and then summarize the discussion. This is important because you'll feel like the students got everything you wanted them to get. It was really obvious, the discussion went great, and they'll walk out. It's like, what was I supposed to learn from this? Well, they have less security about it than you do. And so it really is important at the end. And that's why I said I use those learning objectives at the end. So they say, aha, yes, that's what this discussion was all about. That is what I got out of this. So it is important. And again, I don't put it up as a summary because I said put up the objectives that what I wanted them to get out of it. And then we always judge as a group afterwards whether we actually accomplished those objectives or whether we got bogged down someplace and whether there are objectives that need to be met on another day. Okay, extended classroom experience. This is just something that you want the students to be engaged and stay engaged, and so you can't just. I don't think you should just let things drop in the classroom, because there's all complicated issues and things that you don't know everything about. They'll raise questions. They'll say, you know what, I don't know, but I'll find out and I'll get back to you. Or let me think, I haven't thought about it quite that way. Let me think about it and I'll get back to you. And then actually with email, it's great. You can come back and, think about it, look something up, whatever, and I shoot them off emails to the whole class, say, remember this question? This is how it was. So you kind of let them know that you really care about the answers to these things and the issues. It's not just a matter of we're in this room for an hour and 45 minutes and then we're done. I'm always on the lookout for things that make what we're doing more relevant to the students. Because again, they get more excited and more engaged in things if they can see some tie-in. It doesn't have to be, but it's really great when they realize that they're reading the Wall Street Journal or something and they see something that relates to something we talked about and they wouldn't have understood it before they had taken the class. And I encourage the students to do that as well and share it with other students. And I also talk about research in class. Obviously, my research and how I think about things determines what it is I want to teach, the topics and learning objectives. It informs the kinds of questions that I ask of the students during the discussion, the things I get them to think about. But then they don't actually realize that sometimes. They don't realize how much research informs what goes on in our classroom. And so I found, at least our students love it when you actually show them, bits and pieces from research that relates to what the discussion is about. And I put some pages in here, which probably again too many pages, but this is what I give the students. We talked about, should we be putting brand values on balance sheets of companies? And I always give them, actually done some research in that area with a PhD student from Stanford and some other Stanford faculty members. I always give them the abstract so they have the takeaway, and then even give them some of the tables, and I walk through the tables. I'm an empiricist, so I have tables with T statistics, and they have enough background that they can get the idea of what it is and walk through and say, this is what academics are thinking about these issues. This is what we know from research. This is what we don't know from research, and they really relate to that. They really like it. Okay, the last trick of the trade that I have here is, unfortunately, you have to motivate discussion, and doing really interesting things and all this stuff, that really helps, but putting a lot of course grade on it helps as well. We like it in the business school sometimes where it helped more, but it helps some. So I grade class participation. As I said, 45 to 50% of the course grade is class participation, because I view a lot of the learning takes place right in the classroom. And if they're engaged and are active in the conversation, that's really what I want to know. Yeah. They've never challenged me. And I'm actually very careful about it. I showed you the card that had those 20 boxes for the 20 sessions. I come back after class every day and grade their participation. It's not that hard. I mean, you just spent an hour and 45 minutes with these people. You know, who said what. And I have a point system. My point system goes from 0, well, I give negative points sometimes for class participation. if they completely derail the conversation, or it's just it's like negative. But basically, 0 to 5, I give them some credit for coming to class, because I grade on attendance as part of class. You can't talk if you're not there, so I give them just for showing up. So I know who's there. Take attendance. I have a seating chart with their pictures on it. And that's the other way I get to know them. They sit in the same seat, and I know their faces, so I get to know them really well. It's not that hard. It takes me about 5 minutes. And then I grade, were they active in the conversation? Did they say something? Did they say something really good? Did they say something really great? So I kind of have this point scale, and I just add it up at the end. So it's not like at the end of the quarter I say, oh, let's see, how did this go? And I know what days they were there, and actually sometimes I'll jot down, Fred made this great point about so-and-so, or, the one day my law student just went on for 10 minutes explaining all this intricacies of stuff, and it was fantastic. The whole class was just in awe, and he got great marks for the day. So it's more objective than you actually might think, and I've never had a student question me about it. Yeah. Question was, how often does my class meet? And I said twice a week, and I asked why, and he said his meets once a week, which makes it more difficult to get to know people and get to know the faces and the names. Do you have access to pictures?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so that helps some, although sometimes people have really pictures that don't look like them at all. And you kind of memorize the picture, and then it takes 3 or 4 classes for you to realize that you used to have really long hair and now has really short hair, or whatever it happens to be, and it's so you can get in trouble sometimes. But
how many students do you have?
It varies, but our class will go up to 66 in classroom. And actually, I spent 6 years at the Stanford of the East, and they're 95, and same thing. You have to know all the students and do participate. So when I got here with 66, it was easy, not a problem. Cold calls and voluntary contributions to class discussion. I like to just have people raise their hand and ask, because then they have something to say. And sometimes when you cold call somebody, they're asleep and the conversation gets derailed. It kind of loses a little bit of momentum. So I don't like it. Students don't like it, but it helps keep them on their toes. So I do it from time to time, once or twice a class, just to let them know that I could happen. So I do that. Feedback to students. I give students, the other thing I do, Fred, is I give them feedback midway through the quarter on how they're doing on class participation. So they have some sense. And actually sometimes it's a surprise, and they'll come talk to me and say, you put me in the bottom of the class. And it's like, wow, I thought I was talking. I said, well, you thought you were talking. Maybe your brain was moving, but your lips weren't moving. And we talk about it, and it really helps. And then, of course, making.
How do you give that feedback to students?
How do I get it to them?
Is it a number that you give them?
This is what I give them. It's the next page there. And I hate to be too precise. We're only halfway through the quarter. Quarters are really short to begin with. But I'm coming back every day. I have these numbers. I just add up the numbers, rank them. Don't pay any attention. Just add them, rank them, and then I just cut them in thirds and say, here's where you stand. You're in the top, middle, or bottom third. Just gives them a sense for whether they're doing fine or whether they're at the bottom. And then I always put a little note at the bottom. For the high ones, keep it up. It's great. Love to have your contributions. For the ones at the bottom, should we talk? Yes.
Yeah. Do they understand that you could be in the bottom third and still be doing okay?
Oh yes, and actually this is kind of a little trick of the trade. Grades, our grade distribution is not 3 grades, right? So they can't map. I don't want them mapping this ranking into a grade. I do that on purpose. I want to give them a sense for where they are, but I don't want them to say, oh, I got an A. I mean, we don't in business school we use H's and P pluses and stuff, but I don't want them to say they have an A or a B or I'm failing in class participation. So I do that on purpose, just to give them a sense for where they are. And sometimes some students will start out really quiet, and then they'll start picking up, and I'll tell them, you're in the bottom third, but you've been improving a lot lately. I can tell from my numbers, and I say, keep it up. I appreciate the increase, and blah blah blah. So I give them a little bit of one liner or so on the bottom. Yeah. I'm in charge. They still have to raise their hand, okay? And I have to call on them. And so that's one way. And I think the students realize that when they're dominating, the other students don't like it. And sometimes I will put in the bottom of here, I appreciate your comments, but give other people a chance to talk. But I don't have to do that very often because, again, I'm in the front of the room. And they can tell they have their hand up. I look right at them and then look around the room. And somebody else will raise their hand, or I will cold call somebody. I just won't repeatedly call on the same person. It's my job to make sure that doesn't happen in front of the room. Okay, we're almost out of time here. So in conclusion, I just want to say I think the elements of successful case method teaching are similar to those for any other method, right? You have to focus on student learning. You have to care about that, number one. Provide objectives and structure. Don't just let the conversation wander. Know what it is you want to accomplish. You have to be prepared, engaged, enthusiastic about what you're doing. Otherwise, they won't be. One thing I didn't mention is you have to be willing to say you don't know. And that's much more important in case method teaching because there are all these things about the case, as I said, that you don't even realize complexities. And students will raise questions and I say, I haven't thought about it. That's a good point. I don't know. Either I'll find out or let me think about that some more or whatever. You can't possibly know everything in this kind of a setting. Solicit student feedback, something else I always do. And the form I use is in your packet as well. I do this mid-course. And again, it takes 5 minutes. I give them 5 minutes to fill it out, and it takes me 5 minutes the following class to report back to them as to what they told me. But I ask, see how the pace is. It's too fast or too slow, and that gives me some indication whether I should change or whether everybody's in the middle. And again, I have these 2 outliers, and I tell the people on the top end, be patient, and the people on the bottom end to, I'm not going to slow down, but come talk to me if you have problems, or we'll work. If you think I'm going too fast, deal with me on it. I can't slow down the whole class. So get some sense of how much time they're spending preparing. Ask them about different days, how they think about it, what's good or bad. It gives me feedback for when I'm redesigning the course for the following year, and also gives me some insights into what they think has been interesting or not interesting. So, and then comments and suggestions. So I give that, and then again I report back to them. It takes 5 minutes at the beginning of the next class to kind of give them a summary of what they told me and what changes I might be able to make for the second half of the quarter. Some things I can't change. I'm not going to go back and redo the classes we've done. Syllabus is together. I'm not going to change that. But little things, or too much time on the numbers, not enough time on the numbers, whatever it happens to be, those things I can manage going forward. And then lastly, just have high expectations of yourself and your students. And my experience has been they'll respond. If they know you care, they will care. Interesting material. It's always helpful. Of course, some things you think are interesting, the students don't always agree, but you can find out. Share insights from research. It's not only key to learning, but it lets the students understand what you do with the rest of your life, which is something a lot of students don't get. And once they find out what you're up to, if you're obviously excited about your research, you get them excited about it. Go to lunch with my students, they just want to talk about my research because they know that gets me excited, and they find it fascinating because it's fascinating to me. And the only final comment is, like anything else you do, be a successful case method teacher. It takes time and effort, but the payoff is really high. I learn a lot from my students. I tell them that at the end of each quarter, and it's always true. I walked out with learning something from them and from our discussions that I didn't know. And if I just stood up there and talked all the time, like I did today, I don't learn nearly as much. So thank you very much.